Hello friends, I welcome you to tonight's edition of Sleep Stories for Grown-Ups. If you enjoy these readings, I would encourage you to subscribe, so you will be notified when a new sleep story is ready for you. It is time to unwind. Get comfortable in a place of your choice. Your bed, your chair, or perhaps your couch. Once you have settled in, take a deep breath. As you exhale, you can feel the tension of the day leaving your body. Your day is done. There is nothing left for you to do today but to listen to these stories and relax. And so, we begin. Our Runaway Kite. Of course, there was nobody for us to play with on the big half moon. But then, as Claude says, you can't have everything. We just had to make the most of each other, and we did. The big half moon is miles from anywhere. Except the little half moon, but nobody lives there, so that doesn't count. We live on the big half moon. We are Father and Claude and I, Aunt Esther and Mimi and Dick. It used to be only Father and Claude and I. It is all on account of the kite, that there are more of us. This is what I want to tell you about. Father is the keeper of the big half-moon lighthouse. He has always been the keeper ever since I can remember. Although that isn't very long. I am only 11 years old. Claude is 12. In winter, when the harbor is frozen over, there isn't any need of a light on the big half-moon. And we all move over to the mainland, and Claude and Mimi and Dick and I go to school. But as soon as spring comes, back we sail to our own dear island. So glad that we don't know what to do with ourselves. The funny part used to be that people always pitied us when the time came for us to return. They said we must be so lonesome over there, with no other children near us. And not even a woman to look after us. Why, Claude and I were never lonesome. There was always so much to do, and Claude is splendid at making believe. He makes the very best pirate chief I ever saw. Dick is pretty good, but he can never roar out his orders in the blood-curdling tones that Claude can. Of course, Claude and I would have liked to have someone to play with us, because it is hard to run pirate caves and things like that with only two. But we used to quarrel a good deal with the mainland children in winter, so perhaps it was just as well that there was none of them on the big half-moon. Claude and I never quarreled. We used to argue sometimes and get excited, but that was as far as it ever went. When I saw Claude getting too excited, I gave in to him. He's a boy, you know, and they have to be humored. They are not like girls. As for having a woman to look after us, I thought that just too silly. And so did Claude. What did we need with a woman when we had Father? He could cook all we wanted to eat and make molasses taffy. That was just like a dream. He kept our clothes all mended, and everything about the lighthouse was neat as wax. Of course, I helped him lots. I like pottering around. He used to hear our lessons and tell us splendid stories, and saw that we always said our prayers. Claude and I wouldn't have done anything to make him feel bad for the world. Father is just lovely. To be sure, he didn't seem to have any relations except us. This used to puzzle Claude and me. Everybody on the mainland had relations. Why hadn't we? Was it because we lived on an island? We thought it would be so jolly to have an uncle and aunt and some cousins. Once we asked Father about it, but he looked so sorrowful all of a sudden that we wished we hadn't. He said it was all his fault. I didn't see how that could be, but I never said anything more about it to Father. Still, I did wish we had some relations. It is always lovely out here on the big half-moon in summer. When it is fine, the harbor is blue and calm, with little winds and ripples pouring over it, and the mainland shores like long blue lands where fairies dwell. Away out over the bar, where the big ships go, it is always hazy and pearl-tinted, like the inside of the mussel shells. Claude says he is going to sail out there when he grows up. I would like to, too, but Claude says I can't because I'm a girl. It is dreadfully inconvenient to be a girl at times. When it storms, it is grand to see the great waves come crashing up against the big half-moon, as if they meant to swallow it right down. We can't see the little half-moon at all then. It is hidden by the mist and spume. We had our private cave way up among the rocks, where we kept an old pistol with the lock broken, a rusty cutlass, a pair of knee boots, and Claude's hued beard and wig. Down on the shore, around one of the horns of the half-moon, was the mermaid's pool, where we sailed our toy boats and watched for sea kelpies. We never saw any. Dick says there is no such thing as a kelpie, but then Dick has no imagination. It is no argument against the thing that you've never seen it. I have never seen the pyramids either, but I know that there are pyramids. Every summer we had some hobby. The last summer before Dick and Mimi came, we were crazy about kites. A winter boy on the mainland showed Claude how to make them, and when we went back to the big half-moon, we made kites galore. Even pirating wasn't such good fun. Claude would go around to the other side of the big half-moon, and we would play shipwrecked mariners signaling to each other with kites. Oh, it was very exciting. We had one kite that was a dandy. It was as big as we could make it, and covered with lovely red paper. We had pasted gold tinsel stars all over it, and written our names out in full on it. Claude Martin Leety and Philippa Brewster Leety, Big Half-Moon Lighthouse. That kite had the most magnificent tail, too. It used to scare the gulls nearly to death when we sent up our kites. They didn't know what to make of them, and the big half-moon is such a place for gulls. There are hundreds of them here. One day there was a grand wind for kite flying, and Claude and I were having a splendid time. We used our smaller kites for signaling, and when we got tired of that, Claude sent me to the house for the big one. I'm sure I don't know how it happened, but when I was coming back over the rocks, I tripped and fell, and my elbow went clear through that lovely kite. You would never have believed that one small elbow could make such a big hole. Claude said it was just like a girl to fall and stick her elbow through a kite, but I don't see why it should be any more like a girl than a boy. Do you? We had to hurry to fix the kite if we wanted to send it up before the wind fell. So we rushed into the lighthouse to get some paper. We knew there was no more red paper, and the looks of the kite were spoiled anyhow. So we just took the first thing that came handy. An old letter that was lying on the bookcase in the sitting room. I suppose we shouldn't have taken it, although, as matters turned out, it was the best thing we could have done. But Father was away to the mainland to buy things, and we never thought it could make any difference about an old yellow letter. It was one Father had taken from a drawer in the bookcase which he had cleaned out the night before. We patched the kite up with the letter, a sheet on each side, and dried it by the fire. Then we started out, and up went the kite like a bird. The wind was glorious, and it soared and strained like something alive. All at once, snap! And there was Claude, standing with a bit of cord in his hand, looking as foolish as a flatfish, and our kite sailing along at a fearful rate of speed over the mainland. I might have said to Claude, so like a boy, but I didn't. Instead, I sympathized with him, and pointed out that it really didn't matter, because I had spoiled it by jabbing my elbow through it. By this time, the kite was out of sight, and we never expected to see or hear of it again. A month later, a letter came to the Big Half Moon for Father. Jake Wiggins brought it over in his sloop. Father went off by himself to read it, and such a queer-looking face as he had when he came back. His eyes looked as if he had been crying, but that couldn't be, I suppose, because Claude says men never cry. Anyhow, his face was all glad and soft and smiley. "Do you two young pirates and freebooters want to know what has become of your kite?" he said. Then he sat down beside us on the rocks at the mermaid's pool and told us the whole story and read his letter to us. It was the most amazing thing. It seems Father had had relations after all, a brother and a sister in particular. But when he was a young man, he quarreled with his brother, who didn't treat him very well, but he's been dead for years, so I won't say a word against him, and had gone away from home. He never went back. He never even let them know he was living. Father says that this was very wrong of him, and I suppose it was, since he says so. But I don't see how Father could do anything wrong. Anyway, he had a sister, Esther, whom he loved very much, but he felt bitter against her too, because he thought she took his brother's part too much. So, though a letter of hers, asking him to go back, did reach him, he never answered it, and he never heard anything more. Years afterward, he felt sorry and went back, but his brother was dead, and his sister had gone away, and he couldn't find out a single thing about her. So much for that. And now about the kite. The letter Father had just received was from his sister, our Aunt Esther, and the mother of Dick and Mimi. She was living at a place hundreds of miles inland, and her husband was dead, and, as we found out later, although she did not say a word about it in the letter, she was very poor. One day, when Dick and Mimi were out in the woods, looking for botany specimens, they saw something funny in the top of a tree. Dick climbed up and got it. It was a big red kite with a patch on each side and names written on it. They carried it home to their mother. Dick has since told us that she turned as pale as the dead when she saw our names on it. You see, Philippa was her mother's name, and Claude was her father's, and when she read the letter that was pasted over the hole in the kite, she knew who we must be, for it was the very letter she had written to her brother so long ago. So she sat right down and wrote again, and this was the letter Jake Wiggins brought to the Big Half Moon. It was a beautiful letter. I loved Aunt Esther before I ever saw her, just from that letter. Next day, Father got Jake to take his place for a few days. and he left Claude and me over on the mainland while he went to see Aunt Esther. When he came back, he brought Aunt Esther and Dick and Mimi with him, and they have been here ever since. You don't know how splendid it is. Aunt Esther is such a dear, and Dick and Mimi are too jolly for words. They love the big half moon as well as Claude and I do, and Dick makes a perfectly elegant shipwrecked mariner. But the best of all is that we have relations now. Emily's husband. Emily Fair got out of Hiram Jameson's wagon at the gate. She took her satchel and parasol, and, in her clear musical tones, thanked him for bringing her home. Emily had a very distinctive voice. It was very sweet always, and very cold generally. Sometimes it softened to tenderness with those she loved, but in it there was always an undertone of inflexibility and reserve. Nobody had ever heard Emily Fair's voice tremble. "You're more than welcome, Mrs. Fair," said Hiram Jameson, with a glance of bold admiration. Emily met it with an unflinching indifference. She disliked Hiram Jameson. She had been furious under all her external composure, because he had been at the station when she left the train. Jameson perceived her scorn, but chose to disregard it. Proud as Lucifer, he thought as he drove away. Well, she's none the worse of that. I don't like your weak women. They're always sly. If Stephen Fair don't get better, she'll be free, and then— He did not round out the thought, but he gloated over the memory of Emily, standing by the gate in the harsh, crude light of the autumn sunset, with her tawny, brown hair curling about her pale, oval face, and the scornful glint in her large, dark grey eyes. Emily stood at the gate for some time after Jameson's wagon had disappeared. When the brief burst of sunset splendor had faded out, she turned and went into the garden, where late asters and chrysanthemums still bloomed. She gathered some of the more perfect ones here and there. She loved flowers, but tonight the asters seemed to hurt her, for she presently dropped those she had gathered and deliberately set her foot on them. A sudden gust of wind came over the brown, sodden fields, and the ragged maples around the garden writhed and wailed. The air was raw and chill. The rain that had threatened all day was very near. Emily shivered and went into the house. Amelia Phillips was bending over the fire. She came forward and took Emily's parcels and wraps with a certain gentleness that sat oddly on her grim personality. "Are you tired? I'm glad you're back. Did you walk from the station?" "No, Hiram Jameson was there and offered to drive me home. I'd rather have walked. It's going to be a storm, I think. Where's John?" "He went to the village after supper," said Amelia, lighting a lamp. "We needed some things from the store." The light flared up as she spoke and brought out her strong, almost harsh features and deep-set black eyes. Amelia Phillips looked like an overdone sketch in charcoal. "Has anything happened in Woodford while I've been away?" asked Emily indifferently. Plainly, she did not expect an affirmative answer. Woodford life was not eventful. Amelia glanced at her sharply. So, she had not heard. Amelia had expected that Hiram Jameson would have told her. She wished that he had, for she never felt sure of Emily. The older sister knew that beneath that surface reserve was a passionate nature, broking no restraint when once it overleaped the bounds of her Puritan self-control. Amelia Phillips, with all her natural keen insight and her acquired knowledge of Emily's character, had never been able to fathom the latter's attitude of mind towards her husband. From the time that Emily had come back to her girlhood's home 5 years before, Stephen Fair's name had never crossed her lips. "I suppose you haven't heard that Stephen is very ill," said Amelia slowly. Not a feature of Emily's face changed. Only in her voice, when she spoke, was a curious jarring, as if a false note had been struck in a silver melody. "What is the matter with him?" "Typhoid," answered Amelia briefly. She felt relieved that Emily had taken it so calmly. Amelia hated Stephen Fair with all the intensity of her nature, because she believed that he had treated Emily ill. But she had always been distrustful that Emily in her heart of hearts loved her husband still. That, in Amelia Phillips's opinion, would have betrayed a weakness not to be tolerated. Emily looked at the lamp unwinkingly. "That wick needs trimming," she said. Then, with the sudden recurrence of the untuneful note, "Is he dangerously ill?" "We haven't heard for 3 days. The doctors were not anxious about him Monday, though they said it was a pretty severe case." A faint, wraith-like change of expression drifted over Emily's beautiful face, and was gone in a moment. What was it? Relief? Regret? It would have been impossible to say. When she spoke next, her vibrant voice was as perfectly melodious as usual. "I think I will go to bed, Amelia. John will not be back until late, I suppose, and I am very tired. There comes the rain. I suppose it will spoil all the flowers. They will be beaten to pieces." In the dark hall, Emily paused for a moment and opened the front door to be cut in the face with a whip-like dash of rain. She peered out into the thickly gathering gloom. Beyond, in the garden, she saw the asters tossed about, phantom-like. The wind around the many-cornered old farmhouse was full of wails and sobs. The clock in the sitting room struck 8. Emily shivered and shut the door. She remembered that she had been married at 8 o'clock that very morning 7 years ago. She thought she could see herself coming down the stairs in a white dress, with her bouquet of asters. For a moment she was glad that those mocking flowers in the garden would be all beaten to death before the morning by the lash of wind and rain. Then she recovered her mental poise, put all the hateful memories away from her as she went steadily up the narrow stairs, and along the hall with its curious slant as the house had settled, to her own room under the northwest eaves. When she had put out her light and gone to bed, she found that she could not sleep. She pretended to believe that it was the noise of the storm that kept her awake. Not even to herself would Emily confess that she was waiting and listening nervously for John's return home. That would have been to admit a weakness, and Emily Fair, like Amelia, despised weakness. Every few minutes a gust of wind smote the house, with a roar as of a wild beast, and bombarded Emily's window with a volley of rattling drops. In the silence that came between the gusts, she heard the soft, steady pouring of the rain on the garden paths below, mingled with a faint murmur that came up from the creek beyond the barns, where the pine boughs were thrashing in the storm. Emily suddenly thought of a weird story she had once read years before and long forgotten. A story of a soul that went out in a night of storm and blackness and lost its way between earth and heaven. She shuddered and drew the counterpane over her face. "Of all the things, I hate a fall storm most," she muttered. "It frightens me." Somewhat to her surprise, for even her thoughts were generally well under the control of her unbending will. She could not help thinking of Stephen, thinking of him not tenderly or remorsefully, but impersonally, as a man who counted for nothing in her life. It was so strange to think of Stephen being ill. She had never known him to have a day's sickness in his life before. She looked back over her life, much as if she were glancing with a chill interest at a series of pictures, which in no way concerned her. Scene after scene, face after face, flashed out on the background of the darkness. Emily's mother had died at her birth, but Amelia Phillips, 20 years older than the baby sister, had filled the vacant place so well and with such intuitive tenderness that Emily had never been conscious of missing a mother. John Phillips, too, their grave, silent elder brother, loved and petted their child. Woodford people were fond of saying that John and Amelia spoiled Emily shamefully. Emily Phillips had never been like the other Woodford girls, and had no friends of her own age among them. Her uncommon beauty won her many lovers, but she had never cared for any of them, until Stephen Fair, 15 years her senior, had come a-wooing to the old, grey, willow-girdled Phillips homestead. Amelia and John Phillips never liked him. There was an ancient feud between the families that had died out among the younger generation, but was still potent with the older. From the first, Emily had loved Stephen. Indeed, deep down in her strange, wayward heart, she had cared for him long before the memorable day when he had first looked at her with seeing eyes, and realized that the quiet, unthought-of child who had been growing up at the old Phillips place had blossomed out into a woman of strange, seraph-like beauty and deep grey eyes, whose expression was nevermore to go out of Stephen Fair's remembrance from then till the day of his death. John and Amelia Phillips put their own unjustifiable dislike of Stephen aside when they found that Emily's heart was set on him. The two were married after a brief courtship, and Emily went out from her girlhood's home to the Fair homestead, 2 miles away. Stephen's mother lived with them. Janet Fair had never liked Emily. She had not been willing for Stephen to marry her. But apart from this, the woman had a natural, ineradicable love of making mischief and took a keen pleasure in it. She loved her son, and she had loved her husband. But nevertheless, when Thomas Fair had been alive, she had fomented continual strife and discontented between him and Stephen. Now it became her pleasure to make what trouble she could between Stephen and his wife. She had the advantage of Emily in that she was always sweet-spoken and, on the surface, sweet-tempered. Emily hurt and galled in a score of petty ways, so subtle that they were beyond a man's coarser comprehension, astonished her husband by her fierce outbursts of anger that seemed to him for the most part without reason or excuse. He tried his best to preserve the peace between his wife and mother, and when he failed, not understanding all that Emily really endured at the elder woman's merciless hands, he grew to think her capricious and easily irritated, a spoiled child whose whims must not be taken too seriously. To a certain extent he was right. Emily had been spoiled. The unbroken indulgence which her brother and sister had always accorded her had fitted her but poorly to cope with the trials of a new life. True, Mrs. Fair was an unpleasant woman to live with, but if Emily had chosen to be more patient under petty insults, and less resentful of her husband's well-meant though clumsy efforts for harmony, the older woman could have effected real little mischief. But this Emily refused to be, and the breach between husband and wife widened insidiously. The final rupture came 2 years after their marriage. Emily, in rebellious anger, told her husband that she would no longer live in the same house with his mother. "You must choose between us," she said, her splendid voice vibrating with all the unleashed emotion of her being, yet with no faltering in it. "If she stays, I go." Stephen Fair, harassed and bewildered, was angry with the relentless anger of a patient man, roused at last. "Go then," he said sternly. "I'll never turn my mother from my door for any woman's whim." The stormy red went out of Emily's face, leaving it like a marble wash. "You meant that," she said calmly. "Think well. If I go, I'll never return." "I do mean it," said Stephen. "Leave my house if you will, if you hold your marriage vow so lightly. When your senses return, you are welcome to come back to me. I will never ask you to." Without another word, Emily turned away. That night she went back to John and Amelia. They, on their part, welcomed her back gladly, believing her to be a wronged and ill-used woman. They hated Stephen Fair with a new and personal rancor. The one thing they could hardly have forgiven Emily would have been the fact of her relenting towards him. But she did not relent. In her soul she knew that, with all her just grievances, she had been in the wrong, and for that she could not forgive him. 2 years after she had left Stephen, Mrs. Fair died, and his widowed sister-in-law went to keep house for him. If he thought of Emily, he made no sign. Stephen Fair never broke a word once past. Since their separation, no greeting or look had ever passed between husband and wife. When they met, as they occasionally did, neither impassive face changed. Emily Fair had buried her love deeply. In her pride and anger, she would not let herself remember even where she had dug its grave. And now Stephen was ill. The strange woman felt a certain pride in her own inflexibility, because the fact did not affect her. She told herself that she could not have felt more unconcerned had he been the merest stranger. Nevertheless, she waited and watched for John Phillips's homecoming. At 10 o'clock, she heard his voice in the kitchen. She leaned out of the bed and pulled open her door. She heard voices below, but could not distinguish the words. So she rose and went noiselessly out into the hall, knelt down by the stair railing, and listened. The door of the kitchen was open below her, and a narrow shaft of light struck on her white, intent face. She looked like a woman waiting for a decree of doom. At first, John and Amelia talked of trivial matters. Then the latter said abruptly, "Did you hear how Stephen Fair was?" "He's dying," was the brief response. Emily heard Amelia's startled exclamation. She gripped the square rails with her hands until the sharp edges dinted deep into her fingers. John's voice came up to her again, harsh and expressionless. "He took a bad turn the day before yesterday and has been getting worse ever since. The doctors don't expect him to live till morning." Amelia began to talk rapidly in low tones. Emily heard nothing further. She got up and went blindly back into her room, with such agony tearing at her heartstrings that she dully wondered why she could not shriek aloud. Stephen, her husband, dying. In the burning anguish of that moment, her own soul was as an open book before her. The love she had buried rose from the deeps of her being in an awful, accusing resurrection. Out of her stupor and pain, a purpose formed itself clearly. She must go to Stephen. She must beg and win his forgiveness before it was too late. She dared not go down to John and ask him to take her to her husband. He might refuse. The Phillipses had been known to do even harder things than that. At the best, there would be a storm of protest and objection on her brother's and sister's part, and Emily felt that she could not encounter that in her present mood. It would drive her mad. She lit a lamp and dressed herself noiselessly, but with feverish haste. Then she listened. The house was very still. Amelia and John had gone to bed. She wrapped herself in a heavy woolen shawl hanging in the hall and crept downstairs. With numbed fingers she fumbled at the key of the hall door, turned it, and slipped out into the night. The storm seemed to reach out and clutch her and swallow her up. She went through the garden, where the flowers already were crushed to earth. She crossed the long field beyond, where the rain cut her face like a whip, and the wind almost twisted her in its grasp like a broken reed. Somehow or other, more by blind instinct than anything else, she found the path that led through commons and woods, and waste valleys to her lost home. In after years, that frenzied walk through the storm and blackness seemed as an unbroken nightmare to Emily Fair's recollection. Often she fell. Once, as she did so, a jagged, dead limb of fir struck her forehead and cut it in a gash that marked her for life. As she struggled to her feet and found her way again, the blood trickled down over her face. "Oh God, don't let him die before I get to him. Don't, don't, don't." She prayed desperately, with more of defiance than entreaty in her voice. Then, realizing this, she cried out in horror. Surely some fearsome punishment would come upon her for her wickedness. She would find her husband lying dead. When Emily opened the kitchen door of the Fair homestead, Almira Center cried out in her alarm. Who or what was this creature with the white face and wild eyes, with her torn and dripping garments, and disheveled, wind-writhen hair, and the big drops of blood slowly trickling from her brow? The next moment she recognized Emily, and her face hardened. This woman, Stephen's sister-in-law, had always hated Emily Fair. "What do you want here?" she said harshly. "Where is my husband?" asked Emily. "You can't see him," said Mrs. Sentner defiantly. "The doctors won't allow anyone in the room but those he's used to. Strangers excite him." The intolerance and cruelty of her speech fell on unheeding ears. Emily, understanding only that her husband yet lived, turned to the hall door. "Stand back," she said in a voice that was little more than a thrilling whisper. but which yet had in it something that cowed Almira Sentner's malice. Suddenly she stood aside, and Emily went unhindered up the stairs to the room where the sick man lay. The 2 doctors in attendance were there, together with the trained nurse from the city. Emily pushed them aside and fell on her knees by the bed. One of the doctors made a hasty motion as if to draw her back, but the other checked him. "It doesn't matter now," he said significantly. Stephen Fair turned his languid, unshorn head on the pillow. His dull, fevered eyes met Emily's. He had not recognized anyone all day, but he knew his wife. "Emily," he whispered. Emily drew his head close to her face and kissed his lips passionately. "Stephen, I have come back to you. Forgive me, forgive me. Say that you forgive me." "It's all right, my girl," he said feebly. She buried her face in the pillow beside his with a sob. In the wan, grey light of the autumn dawn, the old doctor came to the bedside and lifted Emily to her feet. She had not stirred the whole night. Now she raised her white face with dumb pleading in her eyes. The doctor glanced at the sleeping form on the bed. "Your husband will live, Mrs. Fair," he said gently. "I think your coming saved him. His joy turned the ebbing tide in favor of life." "Thank God," said Emily. And for the first time in her life, her beautiful voice trembled.